Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
Winter that year arrived at the Burrow not as a mere change of seasons, but as a fully fledged magical entity. It didn't just cover the ground with snow. It altered the very essence of the space around the strange, multi-storied Weasley house. The Burrow, which had always seemed to Ron like something of a living organism held together only by love and a handful of overly optimistic spells, now looked different. Under a thick layer of sparkling frost, every extension, every protrusion, and every leaning roof appeared as part of a great ice sculpture. The house seemed to catch its breath, trying not to disturb the fragile silence that had fallen over the magical world after the final echoes of the Battle of Hogwarts had faded away. Ron Weasley stood by the window in the living room, feeling the cold from the pane seep through his woolen socks. He watched as the sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the snow-covered hills in shades of lavender and ripe plum. This was the first Christmas at home without Fred, and that thought, though no longer as sharp as it had been in the early months, still remained somewhere on the periphery of his consciousness, like a quiet, constant background noise. Ron traced random patterns on the glass with his finger, and for a moment, it seemed to him that the snowflakes outside were moving not under the influence of the wind, but according to some secret rhythm of their own. The air in the room was thick and saturated with scents that could only belong to the Burrow. It smelled of dried tangerine peel, which Mrs. Weasley had already laid out on the mantelpiece. It smelled of the old leather of bookbindings, and that barely perceptible sharp scent of ozone that always appeared when too many household spells were working at once. Ron heard pots clanking in the kitchen floors below, though in the Burrow, the concepts of below and above were always relative. His mother, Molly Weasley, was surpassing herself today. It seemed she had decided to fill every free moment and every square inch of the house with food, light, and care, so that no one would have time for sad reflections. "Ronald, are you trying to melt the snow with the power of thought again?" came the calm, slightly ironic voice of Hermione Granger. She was sitting in a deep, battered armchair that had once belonged to Arthur's grandfather. Hermione was almost completely hidden behind a pile of thick volumes she had brought with her to prepare for future exams, even though they were months away. The light from the fireplace played on her chestnut hair, creating a golden halo around her. Ron turned to her, and his face involuntarily broke into a smile. "I'm just checking if the gnomes have decided to start a revolution," Ron replied, settling on the armrest of her chair. "They've built something like an igloo out there in the garden. I think they're preparing an ambush for the post owl." Hermione looked up from her book. It was some work on ethical aspects of fluid transfiguration, and looked at him with her clever, warm eyes. "Your mum is very worried, Ron," Hermione said softly, and that special note of care sounded in her voice, which always made Ron feel simultaneously protected and a little awkward. "She wants this Christmas to be perfect. Perhaps we should go and help her with the decorations. Harry is already there, helping Mr. Weasley untangle the magical garlands, which seem to have decided that they are living snakes." Ron sighed, feeling the warm air from the fireplace tickle his cheeks. He didn't want to go to the noisy kitchen. He wanted to linger in this moment of cozy silence, where magic was simply part of the background, not a tool for struggle or labor. He looked at the fire in the fireplace. The flames there were not just orange, they shimmered with shades of golden honey and royal blue, releasing tiny sparks that danced in the air like microscopic fireflies. "You're right," Ron finally said, standing up. "If I don't show up in the kitchen now, Mum will think I've gotten hungry and started eating the Christmas candles." Together, they left the living room. The corridors of the Burrow were narrow and winding, every step accompanied by the familiar creaking of floorboards that Ron could have recognized out of 1,000. The house seemed to welcome them, embracing them with a sense of pine needles and melted butter. When they descended to the kitchen, a picture of true magical chaos appeared before them, which, however, had its own internal, harmonious logic. Arthur Weasley stood on a ladder, trying to fix a garland on the ceiling that kept trying to wrap around his neck like an overly affectionate pet. Nearby, Harry Potter held his wand with a smile, helping to direct the magical lights in the right direction. Mrs. Weasley stood in the center of the kitchen, conducting an entire orchestra of kitchen utensils. Knives themselves were cutting vegetables, a rolling pin was confidently rolling out gingerbread dough, and a large silver pot was noisily releasing steam that smelled of cloves and red wine. "Oh, you've finally come," Molly Weasley exclaimed, not looking back but knowing exactly who had entered. "Ronald, dear, take that basket of mistletoe and help your father. Only be careful, it bites if you hold it too tightly." Ron approached the large wicker basket. The mistletoe in it really looked remarkably lively for midwinter. Its leaves glinted with dark green, and the white berries glowed with a soft matte light. When Ron touched a twig, he felt a slight, pleasant tingling in his fingers. The magic of the house was so saturated that it penetrated even ordinary plants. "Good evening, isn't it, Ron?" Harry asked, approaching him. Harry's glasses were a little fogged from the kitchen steam, and there was a small smudge of flour on his cheek. "I like it when the Burrow is so crowded. It makes you forget everything else." "Yes," Ron replied, trying to catch a sprig of mistletoe that was trying to slip out of the basket. "But sometimes it seems to me that the magic here has become stronger. Did you notice? It's as if it's waiting for something." Harry thought for a moment, looking at the lights of the garlands that were now hanging calmly under the ceiling. "Maybe it's just because we're finally home," he said softly. "Truly home." But Ron was not sure about that. He felt it under his skin, a warm, pulsing anticipation. This was not a sense of threat, on the contrary. It was like a premonition of a great miracle that was about to happen in the very core of the winter night. And when the door opened again, letting in a breath of frosty air and the tall figure of George, Ron realized that his premonition had not deceived him. George Weasley entered the kitchen, bringing with him a breath of real December frost that momentarily overwhelmed the sweet sense of baking. His red hair was dusted with snow that resembled tiny sparks in the light of the magical lamps, and a special half-smile was fixed on his face, one that used to be only part of a whole, but had now become his own, slightly quieter and more deliberate. He held a bundle wrapped in old burlap that made a strange sound, like the soft buzzing of bees in a summer garden. "You're late, George," Mrs. Weasley noted, though her voice was devoid of any sternness. She approached her son and gently brushed the snow from his shoulders. "I had started to think you'd decided to spend the night at the shop." "The shop can wait, Mum," George replied, placing his mysterious bundle on the wooden table where the knives had just finished chopping carrots. "But Christmas at the Burrow won't wait. Besides, I've brought something that will help us stir up this overly calm air." Ron watched his brother, noticing how George was trying to fill the space that had once belonged to two. It was a subtle, almost invisible task, to be cheerful for himself and for the one who was no longer there. Fred had always been a master of loud effects, but George was now mastering a different magic, the magic of support. Ron felt a slight pang of conscience. He himself often tried simply not to remember the loss, hoping that silence would heal the wounds, but looking at George, he understood that memory could be not a burden, but fuel for the fire in the fireplace. "And what is this strange object?" Ginny asked, approaching and looking at the burlap with curiosity. "I hope it's not another batch of canary creams. The last time we tasted them, Dad spent 3 days clucking instead of reading ministry reports." "Much better, little sister," George said, carefully unwrapping the fabric. Under the burlap was an old, tarnished silver chalice on a tall stem. Its surface was covered with engravings that seemed to be constantly moving. Ron looked closer. They were tiny figures of sleeping dragons intertwined with open books and stars that slowly traveled around the circle of the cup. A soft, pulsing light came from the vessel, smelling of the old paper silence of a library and freshly cut grass. "This is the chalice of sincere intentions," George announced solemnly, and his voice took on a depth inherent in ancient legends. "I found it in a very neglected corner of our shop. It seems Fred bought it back in our 4th year from some strange merchant in Knockturn Alley. He always said we would need it for a special occasion." At the mention of Fred, Mrs. Weasley stopped for a moment, her hand frozen over the saucepot, but she quickly composed herself and only smiled more warmly. The light from the chalice seemed to respond to this memory, becoming a little brighter and warmer, like the color of melted butter. "So, the rules of the Secret Santa game, Weasley style," George continued, taking out clean scraps of parchment and a quill. "Everyone writes their name. But the chalice doesn't just choose a pair. It reads what you truly need this winter. The gift doesn't necessarily have to be bought. It has to be appropriate." Ron felt a flicker of curiosity, mixed with a slight fear. Magic that reads the needs of the heart had always seemed a bit unpredictable to him. He looked at Hermione. She was already biting her lip, a sure sign that she was trying to analyze the magical structure of the artifact. "And what if the chalice is wrong?" Ron asked, taking his scrap of parchment. "You know, if it decides I need a new book on the history of magical disasters, when really I just want a new pair of warm socks." "The chalice is never wrong, Ronald," George replied, winking at his brother. "It just sees a bit deeper than your stomach." Everyone present began to write their names. Ron wrote Ronald Bilius Weasley, and thought for a moment. What did he really need? After everything they had been through, the battle, the loss, the constant fear, he most of all craved the feeling that everything was falling back into place. That the Burrow was once again the place where the most terrible problem could only be an invasion of gnomes or a failed spell from Mrs. Roltre Weasley. He threw his paper into the silvery haze that had begun to rise over the chalice. When all the names had disappeared inside, the vessel began to vibrate quietly. The sound was so low and pleasant that Ron felt his shoulders, which he habitually held tense, relax. "Now," said George, handing the chalice to Ron, "the youngest of the brothers starts." "Pull, Ron." Ron carefully dipped his hand into the silvery fog. His fingers touched the cold metal of the bottom, and then something warm, like a tiny living bird, nuzzled into his palm. He grabbed this scrap of warmth and pulled it out into the light. For a moment, silence fell in the kitchen. Ron unfolded the parchment, but instead of clear letters, he saw something entirely different. Shimmering silver patterns appeared on the white surface, constantly changing, resembling frost on a window forming into complex pictures. "What does it say?" Harry asked, leaning closer. "I don't know," Ron replied distractedly. "There's no name here. It's like a snow-covered garden is drawn here." And a tree. The old apple tree by our shed. Hermione frowned and took out her wand, but George stopped her with a light gesture of his hand. "No need, Hermione," he said softly, looking closely at the parchment in Ron's hands. His voice became serious. "It seems the chalice decided that Ron has a special task. This isn't just a name, it's an instruction." Ron looked at the paper again. The silver lines seemed to come alive. Tiny paw prints appeared on the drawn snow, leading somewhere deep into the garden. Then the drawing trembled and turned into the outlines of a face that seemed extremely familiar to Ron, but it vanished faster than he could recognize it. "I think," Ron said slowly, feeling his heart start to beat faster, "that my secret Santa is not one of you. Or at least, not entirely. The magic of the house sometimes has its own mind," Arthur Weasley remarked, having silently observed the process all this time. He approached his son and placed a hand on his shoulder. "The Burrow remembers everything that happened here for generations. Perhaps now, when we are trying to bring joy back here, the house itself decided to show us the way." Ron felt the piece of paper in his sweater pocket start to emit a faint but quite perceptible warmth. This was not like the usual magic of spells. It was something more ancient, organic, as if the very ground under the house was trying to speak to him. At that moment, Mrs. Weasley clapped her hands, trying to diffuse the tense atmosphere. "Well, riddles are riddles, but dinner won't eat itself," she exclaimed, and tears glinted in her eyes, which she immediately hid behind a smile. "Ronald, don't stand there like a petrified gargoyle. Help Harry set the plates. Tonight we dine by candlelight, and no wands at the table." Ron began to help, but his thoughts were far from the turkey and pudding. He felt that this Christmas would not just be a quiet family holiday. Silver tracks on paper, strange warmth in his pocket, and George's voice that so reminded him of what was lost. All this was woven into a great mystery that he, and only he, had to solve amidst the snow-covered hills around the Burrow. Outside, the night was getting darker, and the snow thicker. But inside the house, in the heart of magical chaos, a small spark of silvery light had already begun its path, preparing an adventure for Ron Weasley that would forever change his understanding of what a true home is. When the festive dinner finally came to an end, the Burrow sank into that special state that occurs only after a large, noisy banquet. It was the moment when the chaos gradually settled, leaving behind only the cozy hum of magic and the quiet sounds of cleaning. Mrs. Weasley, tired but evidently satisfied, sent the last group of plates to the sink with a single wave of her wand, where they began to wash themselves merrily to the accompaniment of a quiet clinking of porcelain. Ron climbed to the upper floor, feeling a pleasant heaviness in his legs. His room on the very attic, under the sharp roof, had always seemed to him the safest place in the world, even when the ghouls settled there, fond of rattling pipes in the walls. Today the attic met him with the smell of old dust, dried herbs, and the cozy presence of Pigwidgeon, a tiny owl that was now sleeping peacefully, head tucked under a wing. Ron sat on the edge of the bed without lighting any light. The room was flooded with the cold, blue glow of the full moon, penetrating through the small skylight. He remembered the piece of paper in his pocket. Taking it out, Ron noticed that the silver shimmering had become even more intense. Now it didn't just glow, it pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. "What are you exactly?" Ron whispered softly, addressing the piece of parchment. He traced his finger over the silver lines, and at that very moment felt a strange, light nudge inside his head. This was not like the legilimency he had seen performed by Snape or Voldemort. It was much softer, like a distant voice calling his name through a thick bank of fog. Ron closed his eyes, and before his inner vision the garden appeared again, but this time he saw it not from the window. It was as if he were flying over the snow-covered grass, approaching the old, leaning shed, where his father kept all sorts of Muggle contraptions. Suddenly, something in the corridor outside the door creaked softly. This was not the usual sound of old wood accustomed to expanding in the frost. It was a distinct sound of steps, light, almost weightless, as if someone were stepping not on the floor, but on the air itself. Ron stood up cautiously, trying not to make a noise. He threw an old blanket that smelled of home over his shoulders, and slowly opened the door of his room. The corridor was empty, but a barely perceptible trail of silver dust hung in the air, similar to what he had seen in the Chalice of Sincere Intentions. This trail stretched down the stairs, rounding corners and disappearing into the darkness of the lower floors. "Is anyone else seeing this?" Ron said to himself, stepping cautiously onto the first step. The stairs in the burrow had their own character. The third step from the top always gave a loud crack if stepped on too confidently, while the fifth squeaked thinly like an angry mouse. Ron knew every centimeter of this magical geography. He skipped over the dangerous spots, holding onto the banister, which felt warm and almost alive under his hand. When he reached the landing on the second floor, he stopped before the famous Weasley clock. In the moonlight, the golden hands looked ghostly. Ron involuntarily glanced at Fred's hand. It was not moving, but it did not point to mortal peril or hospital. It was frozen in a strange position between home and traveling, as if its owner himself did not know where he was now. "We miss you," Ron said softly, looking at the clock. It seemed to him that the hand twitched ever so slightly, as if in response to his words. Suddenly, the silver trail in the air thickened, forming something like a thin thread leading to the living room door. Ron followed it. In the living room, the embers still glowed in the fireplace, casting long, moving shadows on the walls. George's silver chalice still stood on the table. Now it was absolutely silent. But a thin layer of frost had gathered around its edges, even though it was warm in the room. Ron approached the window. What he saw in the garden made him catch his breath. In the middle of the snow-covered lawn, exactly where the gnomes usually lived, stood a tall figure. It was semi-transparent, woven from that same moonlight and silver sparks. The figure did not move. It simply looked toward the house, and it seemed to Ron that he felt this gaze upon him, not hostile, but full of deep, endless longing and hope. "Who are you?" Ron asked in a whisper, though he knew that through the thick glass, no one would hear him. The figure slowly raised its hand and pointed toward the old shed, repeating the same gesture Ron had seen in his vision in the attic. Then the shadow began to dissolve, turning into billions of tiny snowflakes that swirled in a vortex and disappeared. Ron felt a chill run down his spine. It was not fear. It was that same feeling he had in his first year when he first entered the Great Hall. The feeling that he was touching something great, mysterious, and incredibly important. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep until he found out what was hidden in that shed. His father always said that nothing in the burrow was accidental, and if magic decided to show him this path, he had to take it. Ron returned to the corridor, grabbed his old coat and boots. He needed to go outside, into the very heart of the December night, where answers to questions he didn't even dare to formulate were waiting. "Just don't tell Mum," he muttered, passing by the portrait of old Auntie Muriel, who, fortunately, was fast asleep and only snoring loudly. He pressed down on the handle of the front door. The metal was searingly cold. When the door opened, the frosty air instantly filled his lungs, displacing the warmth of the house. Ron took the first step onto the fresh, untouched snow, and it crunched under his weight like broken glass. Ahead, under the light of the moon, the snow-covered Weasley garden looked like another planet, where a secret as old as the world itself could be hidden behind every bush. The cold of the December night met Ron not as an enemy, but as a stern old acquaintance. The first step across the threshold of the burrow made his lungs compress from the unexpected sharpness of the air, which smelled of frozen earth, the purity of the heavenly heights, and a barely perceptible aroma of smoke from the chimney that had already managed to cool down. The snow under his feet was not just soft, it was crisp and brittle, as if thousands of small glass bells were breaking under his every step. Ron wrapped himself tighter in his old cloak, feeling the frost try to find a gap in the woolen fabric. He turned and looked at the burrow. From the outside, the house seemed even more whimsical. Its numerous extensions, held together by magic and a promise, were backlit from within by the soft golden light of the windows. It looked so cozy that for a moment he wanted to go back to the warm fireplace and safe conversations with Harry and Hermione. Harry is probably already asleep now and seeing dreams about flying on a broomstick, Ron thought, looking at the snow-covered slope of the hill. And Hermione is surely rereading that same chapter about runes, trying to find an author's error. He often felt like the third wheel in this perfect machine of friendship. Harry was the hero, the chosen one, the symbol of hope. Hermione was the mind, the logic, the person who always knew the answer. And he was just Ron. The son who always wore hand-me-down clothes from his brothers. The friend who sometimes got lost in the shadow of the greatness of others. However, today, under this cold moonlight, he felt something else. This silver thread in his pocket belonged only to him. This was his secret, his quest, and for the first time in a long time he did not feel the need to call his friends for help. Ron began to descend through the garden toward the old shed. The silver trail he had seen earlier now became almost tangible in the air. It glittered above the surface of the snow, like a path laid out by someone invisible. Suddenly, a movement to the right caught his attention. Near a currant bush, which in summer was always occupied by an army of gnomes, something extraordinary was happening. Ron stopped, pressing his hand to the wand in his pocket. Usually, the gnomes of the burrow were rude, noisy creatures who were just waiting for a chance to bite someone's ankle or throw a potato down the chimney. But these were different. A dozen gnomes in tiny pointed hats covered with frost were working in complete silence. They were not fighting or cursing. On the contrary, they were constructing strange, elegant structures with incredible thoroughness from snow and shards of ice. Ron approached closer, holding his breath. The gnomes were building ice copies of Hogwarts, the Ministry of Magic, and even the burrow itself. Every detail, every tower, every little window, was executed with filigree precision. "Good evening, Mr. Weasley." One of the gnomes suddenly squeaked, taking off his frozen hat and bowing politely. "A nice night for a walk, isn't it?" Ron almost dropped his wand in surprise. Hearing a polite address from a gnome was like hearing Professor Snape praise him for his success in potions. You're talking?" Ron asked, blinking. "We always talk," the gnome replied, carefully installing an icy spire on the model of the astronomy tower. "Just usually, we have no reasons for social conversation. The magic of this night is very well bred, It demands order from us. The gnome pointed his small hand at an ice sculpture that stood separately. It was Fred. Ron recognized him instantly. Even in the ice, that same spark in his eyes and a barely perceptible tilt of the head were captured, as if he were preparing to say something extremely funny. The sculpture glowed with the same silver light as the piece of paper in Ron's pocket. "He is helping us," the gnome added, returning to his work. "The light leads us, and you, Mr. Weasley, are late. The silver thread will not wait forever." Ron felt his throat tighten. He looked at the icy Fred, and for a moment it seemed to him that the sculpture winked at him. It was not scary. It was like a warm embrace in the middle of winter. He understood that the gnomes were not hindering him. They were guarding this path. "Thank you," Ron whispered, feeling it become hot in his chest, despite the frost. He went further, past the icy palaces and castles the gnomes were erecting in silent tribute. Every step moved him further from the familiar world and closer to the place where magic became pure and primal. Ahead, the old shed doors were already visible, covered with whimsical patterns of frost. They were not locked, but they emitted such a powerful sense of ancient power that Ron hesitated for a moment. He knew. Whatever he found behind these doors would change not only this Christmas but himself as well. Ron pulled out his wand. Not for protection, but to feel the connection with his inner strength. "Lumos," he said softly. The tip of the wand flared with a soft milky light that mixed with the moonlight. Ron reached out to the frozen metal handle. It was searingly cold, but as soon as he touched it, the silver thread in his pocket flared with bright light, and the shed doors slowly, with a solemn creak, opened on their own. Inside, darkness reigned, but it was not that empty darkness that is worth fearing. It was a darkness full of expectation, similar to a theater hall before the start of a major performance. And there, in the depths, among old Muggle parts and garden tools, something shone, pure, quiet, and incredibly beautiful. When the shed doors finally yielded, Ron found himself in a space where time, it seemed, had a completely different density. The air here was motionless and heavy, saturated with aromas that could only belong to the private universe of Arthur Weasley. Here it smelled of machine oil, rusty iron, old rubber, and that specific, sweetish, dusty smell that Muggle things have when they have lain motionless for decades. But now, over this familiar bouquet, another aroma prevailed, a thin, barely perceptible scent of ozone and fresh pine coming from the very depths of the room. Ron moved forward cautiously, trying not to knock over stacks of old batteries and rusted gears that Dad considered, quote, extraordinarily promising inventions. The light of his wand picked out strange objects from the darkness, a disassembled toaster that once tried to fly, empty vials from magical potions that now served as holders for Muggle nails, and old garden tools covered with cobwebs that glittered in the rays of Lumos. The silver thread that brought him here now ended near a large wooden box covered with a heavy tarp. The tarp was so old that upon touch it felt cold and hard, like dragon skin. Ron felt his heart do an unexpected somersault. His fingers clutching the edge of the fabric trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the premonition of what was now about to open. He pulled the tarp toward him sharply. Dust rose into the air in a golden cloud, dancing in the wand light, and before Ron stood an old lantern, darkened by time. It was made of silver, as dull as George's chalice, and instead of ordinary glass, it had rock crystal inserts covered with thin carvings in the form of constellations. As soon as Ron touched the lantern, the silver thread in his pocket flared and instantly flowed into the artifact. The lantern came alive. Inside it there was no candle or magical fire. There pulsed a soft, liquid light that resembled a molten moonbeam. It was so alive that Ron could hear a quiet, rhythmic breathing coming from the device. "This is not just a lantern," Ron whispered, feeling the warmth from the crystal spread through his palms. "This is a memory catcher." Suddenly, the crystal facets of the lantern began to project amazing images onto the walls of the shed. On the dirty boards and rusty saws, pictures from the past bloomed. Ron saw himself as quite a little toddler as he first tries to catch a garden gnome. He saw Mum laughing as she hangs laundry under the summer sun. And he saw Fred. Fred was standing right here in this shed, concentrating on tinkering with something, hiding a smile. "You found it, Ronnie." A voice suddenly sounded, making Ron jump. This was not a real sound, but rather an echo that sounded directly in his head. He looked around, but there was no one in the shed. However, the lantern now shone differently. One of its rays became longer and clearer. It pointed not toward the exit, but toward the floor, under an old workbench. There, among the sawdust and shavings, Ron noticed a small parcel, wrapped in simple brown paper. There was no sender's name on it, only a familiar silvery symbol, two intertwined letters W, that glowed with a faint blue fire. Ron leaned down to pick up the parcel, but at that moment, the lantern suddenly went out. The darkness became so thick that the lumos, on the tip of the wand, seemed only a weak spark. Outside the shed doors a strange sound was heard, a heavy breath, and the crunch of snow under someone's large steps. This was not a gnome and not a person. Something large and ancient was approaching the shed, blocking the moonlight in the doorway. Ron pressed the parcel to his chest, feeling his heart pounding against his ribs. He understood that the first part of his quest was completed, but the true trial was just beginning. The secret Santa demanded not only sincere intentions, but also the courage to meet what was hiding in the shadows of the old house. He held his breath, looking at the dark silhouette that filled the entrance. And at that moment in his pocket, the piece of paper from the chalice of sincere intentions flared again, showing a new clue. The dark silhouette that filled the doorway of the shed appeared as if it were carved from the very substance of the night, yet its edges were rimmed with a soft ghostly radiance from the moon. Ron remained frozen, feeling the cold vapor of his own breath tickle his cheeks. He clutched the found parcel tightly against his chest, while the fingers of his other hand instinctively tightened around his wand. Though he remembered George's earlier counsel, that the magic of this particular night would not suffer aggression. The creature took a step forward, and Ron heard not just the crunch of snow, but a strange, wet sound, like heavy stones being rolled around in a cavernous mouth. In the faint light of the wand still flickering on the floor, he finally recognized the monster. It was the ghoul that usually resided in their attic, but it had changed. Its usually pale, blistered skin now shimmered, as though it had been dusted with fine salt or silver powder. The ghoul did not howl or rattle pipes. It simply stared at Ron with its large, cloudy eyes, which now reflected all the stardust of the night. You feel it too, don't you?" Ron whispered softly, feeling his fear slowly give way to boundless amazement. Instead of an answer, the ghoul emitted a sound like the low, contented purring of a massive cat. It tilted its head, and Ron noticed that wrapped around the creature's neck was Fred's old, moth-eaten scarf, the same one with bright yellow stripes that Ron thought had been lost during the post-war cleanup. The ghoul extended a long, knotted arm and gently touched the lantern Ron held in his hands. From this touch, the crystal facets of the artifact flared once more, flooding the shed with warm amber light. "Go home," the ghoul said, and although its voice was but a raspy echo, Ron clearly understood the command. The light must return to the house. The creature retreated, clearing the path, and in a moment dissolved into the shadows beneath the trees, leaving behind only the faint scent of damp earth and pine. Ron stood motionless for several more seconds, listening to the pounding of his own heart. He realized that Secret Santa had enlisted even the most hidden inhabitants of the Burrow to convey this message to him. The return to the house seemed to Ron like a journey through a dream. The snow continued to fall, covering his tracks as if nature itself were trying to hide his nocturnal excursion. When he finally crossed the threshold of the kitchen, silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic breathing of the Weasley clock. Ron slipped upstairs, diligently avoiding all the squeaky floorboards he had known since childhood. Once in his room, he hid the lantern and the parcel at the very bottom of his school trunk, burying them under old textbooks and spare cuffs. He lay in bed, but sleep would not come. Before his eyes stood the ice sculptures of the gnomes and the silvery eyes of the ghoul. Ron felt that this lantern was only the beginning of a great magical map he was to uncover. The next morning at the Burrow began not with an alarm, but with a full cannonade of festive sounds. Ron opened his eyes and saw that his room was flooded with the cold but brilliant winter sun. From below came the shouts of Mrs. Weasley, the laughter of Ginny, and the characteristic clattering of plates, a sign that the Christmas breakfast was already in full swing. He descended to the kitchen, trying to look as if he had slept through the whole night without waking. Harry and Hermione were already at the table. Hermione, as always, held a cup of tea and some parchment, but her look was somewhat bewildered. "Look at this," Hermione said when Ron sat down beside her. "I opened my Ancient Runes book this morning, which I know for a fact I left closed." And there, between the pages, she held out a thin sheet, yellowed with age, to Ron. It was a lost page from a rare edition that Hermione had been searching for the last 3 years. The sheet looked completely new despite its age, and a barely perceptible silvery shimmer came from it, exactly the same as from Ron's piece of paper. "It's amazing," Harry added, smiling. "And I found an old silver coin in my boot with the image of a falcon. My mum once mentioned it in her letters I found in Godric's Hollow. It was her family's talisman." Ron felt his throat go dry. He glanced at Mum. Mrs. Weasley was just taking fresh rolls out of the oven, and for the first time in a long time, that frozen mask of fatigue was gone from her face. She looked younger, as if the light the ghoul spoke of had already begun to penetrate her heart. "It seems our Secret Santa started his work earlier than we expected," Arthur Weasley remarked, entering the kitchen. He held apart from an old Muggle clock. "This thing simply rolled to my feet when I went down to the garage. I've been looking for such a gear for 10 years. Ron silently finished his scrambled eggs, feeling the heaviness of the lantern lying in the trunk above his head. He understood these gifts were only preparation for something larger, and the main gift, the one that lay in the brown paper with the W symbol, was intended for someone else, someone who needed healing most of all. "Ron, you're awfully quiet today," Ginny noted, narrowing her eyes. "Did you also get something special and you're keeping quiet?" I just haven't quite woken up yet," Ron lied, trying not to look his sister in the eyes. "I must have just been lucky to sleep without any dreams about exams." But he knew he wouldn't be able to hide his secret for long. The silvery tracks in the garden were waiting for him, and the next part of the adventure required from him not only cleverness, but also readiness to open the family's old wounds to finally allow them to heal. After breakfast, when the living room filled with the sounds of Christmas carols echoing from the magical radio of Celestina Warbeck, Ron felt the parcel in his pocket becoming increasingly heavy. This was not a physical weight, it was a feeling of magical pressure, as if the object inside demanded immediate attention. Taking advantage of Hermione being fascinated with discussing new recipes for drip-free window-cleaning potions with Mum, and Harry helping Mr. Weasley disassemble another portion of Muggle plugs, Ron quietly slipped out to the backyard. The winter garden met him with a blinding white glow. The sun having risen over the hills of Ottery St. Catchpole turned every frozen apple branch into a work of art made of transparent crystal. Ron walked past the empty shed where he had met the ghoul during the night and headed deeper into the garden, to where the old trees stood so densely that their crowns intertwined, creating a natural bower. He sat on an old wooden bench covered with a thick layer of snow and carefully pulled out the parcel. The brown paper under his fingers seemed warm, almost alive. Ron unwrapped it with as much care as if it were a dragon's egg inside. Inside lay a small wooden figure of a bird. It was carved from dark oak, but the wood looked strange. Thin, spiderweb-like veins of silver ran through it, pulsing with light in time with Ron's breathing. The bird did not have a clearly defined species. It was something between a phoenix and a common swallow, but in its pose one felt incredible pride, and at the same time a deep sadness. "This is your work, then," Ron whispered, addressing the emptiness between the trees. He remembered how Fred once, before the war, became interested in wood carving. He had said he wanted to create an army of wooden spies for the shop that could transmit messages without the help of owls. But after his brother's death, all his unfinished projects seemed to simply disappear. Ron pulled out the memory catcher lantern and placed it on his knee. As soon as the light of the lantern touched the wooden bird, the figure shuddered. Tiny wings moved slightly, and the garden around Ron began to change. The golden sunlight suddenly went out, giving way to a shimmering haze that came from the depths of the trees. A scene appeared before Ron. Two red-haired boys, himself and George, are running through this very garden, trying to catch Fred, who holds a similar wooden figure in his hands. "If you can catch the light, Ronnie, you'll never get lost in the dark," the ghostly Fred shouted, and his laughter rang out in the winter air like the peal of crystal bells. The scene melted away, leaving Ron in a silence that now seemed even thicker. The bird in his hands was still again, but now one of its silver veins pointed directly toward the old pond, which was located on the very edge of the Burrow's territory. Ron stood up, feeling his hands becoming cold, but not from the frost, but from excitement. He knew that this pond was Fred's favorite place. It was there they spent hours devising new jokes, or just watching the sun reflect in the water. The path to the pond was not easy. The snow here was much deeper, and the old hawthorn bushes tried to catch his cloak like little thorny fingers. Ron heard Mrs. Weasley calling him for lunch somewhere far away in the house, but he could not return. The magic of the lantern led him forward, and every step revealed new sounds of the garden. A quiet crackling of ice on the branches, the whisper of the wind caught in the dry reeds, and a distant, barely audible humming of the earth's magical currents. When he finally reached the pond, he saw that the water in it was not just frozen. The ice had a strange pearlescent shade, and lights were swimming under its surface, similar to small goldfish. But they were not fish. They were memories. "Secret Santa wants me to pull something out of there," Ron guessed, looking at the lantern. He approached the very edge of the ice. It was much colder here. The air smelled of old water, dampness, and something sweet, similar to the aroma of Christmas pudding. Ron leaned over, and at that moment, The wooden bird in his pocket began to heat up so much that he was forced to pull it out. The bird flew out of his palm and began to circle over the hole, which Ron hadn't even noticed at first. Each circle of the bird left a silver trail in the air, and the ice beneath it began to slowly melt, although the frost only intensified. I can't do this alone, Ron suddenly realized. I need help from someone who knew Fred as well as I did. He looked around at the house. He needed to call George, but he was afraid the magic would disappear if he brought someone else. However, the lantern flared again, showing him a new vision. George is sitting in his room, looking at the empty bed beside him, and in his eyes is that same darkness that Ron was trying to dissipate with this silver light. You must trust not only magic but also your heart, Ronald. Fred's voice was heard again, but this time it was so real that Ron felt the smell of his favorite explosive sweets for a moment. Ron took a deep breath, feeling the frosty air burn his lungs. He knew that the next step would require the greatest courage from him, the courage to be sincere with his brother. He turned and ran back toward the house, leaving deep tracks behind him on the pristine snow, while the wooden bird continued its magical circle over the pond, waiting for the return of the light. Ron burst into the kitchen, breathing heavily, his face bright red from the run and the frost. Mrs. Weasley, who was just serving up the fragrant beef stew onto the plates, raised her eyebrows in surprise, seeing her son in such a state. Ronald, where have you been? All in snow, as if you've just returned from an expedition to the Himalayas, she exclaimed, but there was no irritation in her voice, only light anxiety. Sit down immediately, everything is getting cold. Mum, I urgently need to talk to George, Ron blurted out, ignoring the aroma of the meat that usually made his head spin. George, who was sitting in the corner, lazily stirring his tea, looked up. Curiosity flashed in his gaze, mixed with that same melancholy Ron had seen in the lantern's vision. What is it, Ronnie? Did you find a stash with our old fireworks and can't open it? George asked, trying to maintain his usual joking tone, but his voice sounded a bit tense. No, it concerns Secret Santa and the pond. I need your help. Right now, Ron replied seriously. Harry and Hermione exchanged glances. They knew Ron too well not to notice when he was truly excited about something. Hermione already wanted to ask something about the magical parameters of the pond in winter, but Ron stopped her with a short glance. This was something family-oriented, something that belonged only to the Weasleys. George slowly stood up, setting aside his cup. He saw that Ron was not joking. Something in the expression of his younger brother's face reminded him of himself many years ago. That same stubbornness and belief in the impossible. Good, George said simply. Mum, we'll be back in 10 minutes. I promise I won't let him fall into a hole. They went outside in silence. The sun had already begun to sink toward the horizon, and the shadows from the apple trees elongated, becoming deep blue on the sparkling snow. Ron led his brother along the same path he had made earlier. Do you see this? Ron asked, pointing to the silvery glow still hanging around the apple trees. George stopped. He narrowed his eyes, and a profound shock was reflected on his face. This is Fred's magic, he said quietly. I'd recognize this handwriting anywhere. He always wove these tiny sparks into his spells that smelled of cotton candy. But how is it possible? I found a lantern, George. A memory catcher. It led me to the pond. Ron explained, pulling out the artifact. When they approached the water, the wooden bird was still circling in the air. Seeing George, the figure made a sound similar to a joyful chirping and landed right on his shoulder. George froze, his breath becoming intermittent. He carefully touched the wood with his fingers, and the silver veins on the bird flared with a bright, clean light. "He made it for me," George whispered. "It was my gift for that birthday, which we never managed to celebrate together." Ron saw tears well up in his brother's eyes, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of liberation. The light from the lantern now united them both, creating a dome of pure, warm magic around the pond. The ice on the pond began to crack, but not as if under weight, but as if it were opening to give back what it had hidden all winter. From under the water, a small metal box slowly rose. It was covered with magical frost, but on its lid, an engraving was clearly visible. For those who are not afraid to remember. "This is our next step," said Ron, handing the lantern to George. "The chalice chose me to find this, but we must open it together." He felt the magic of the burrow around them, pulsing with gratitude. The house, the garden, and even the old pond, all this was part of a great living network that finally began to restore itself. And although much unknown lay ahead, Ron knew that the most difficult obstacle, the wall of silence and loneliness, had been overcome. The air inside the burrow met the brothers with a thick warmth, almost tangible to the touch, which smelled of rosemary, baked potatoes, and the sweet smoke of fruitwood. After the icy silence by the pond, the sounds of the kitchen seemed incredibly loud. The ticking of the clock, the rhythmic hissing of the kettle on the stove, and the muffled laughter of Harry and Hermione from the living room created a safe cocoon in which magic felt at home. George and Ron passed by Mrs. Weasley, who was just working her magic over a large sauceboat. She only raised her eyes for a moment, noticing their shared, focused look. In her gaze there were no questions. Only the silent blessing of a mother who felt that between her sons that same invisible thread of understanding, which had been so lacking in recent months, had finally stretched. "We'll be upstairs," George threw out briefly, firmly holding the metal box under his arm as if it were the greatest treasure of the Gringotts vaults. They climbed to Ron's room. Here, under the very roof, the light of the evening sun broke through a small window, painting the orange walls, decorated with Chudley Cannon's posters, in a deep terracotta color. George placed the box on an old wooden table. The ice on its surface had already begun to melt, turning into small drops of water that glowed from within with a soft blue light. "It doesn't open with an ordinary alohomora," Ron noted, watching George unsuccessfully try to lift the lid with his wand. "I already tried that by the pond," in a whisper. "Of course it doesn't open," George said, and the notes of that same inventor he had always been sounded in his voice again. Fred adored mechanical locks, reinforced by emotional resonance. "You must not just want to open it, you must remember the reason why it is important." Ron moved closer. He placed his hand on the cold metal, next to George's hand. Together they formed a strange picture, the tall, matured George and Ron, who during this year had become almost the same height, but still retained that special childish sincerity in his gaze. "Let's remember that day when we first brought this pond here," Ron said softly, looking at the intertwined W letters on the lid. "Remember, we were 7 years old, and we were trying to teach the gnomes synchronized swimming." George laughed quietly, and this laughter was the purest magic Ron had heard all day. "Mum was in such despair then that she wanted to turn us all into water lilies," George added. As soon as these words flew from his lips, the box emitted a soft sound, similar to the sigh of an old mechanism. The silvery frost on the lid instantly evaporated, leaving behind a light scent of summer rain. The lid slowly fell back, revealing the contents. Inside there was no gold or jewels. There lay dozens of tiny glass spheres, similar to the marbles that Muggle children liked to play with. But inside each ball, life was swirling, clouds were moving there, lightning was flashing, and magical fireworks were exploding. On top of them lay a scroll of parchment tied with a bright red ribbon. "This is the core of laughter," George whispered, carefully taking one of the balls. "Our last development with Fred. We wanted to create Christmas in a bottle. Each ball contains a concentrated happy memory that can be released into the air to warm an entire room." Ron took the parchment and unrolled it. The handwriting was sweeping, fast, and incredibly alive. "For Ron and George, if you are reading this, it means the winter has turned out too cold. Don't wait for the sun to come out from behind the clouds. Release your own light. Start with the kitchen. Mum always said that the heart of the house is there. Ronnie, don't forget, you are not just the third brother. You are the one who holds us all together when we get too carried away with flying. Merry Christmas, Weasleys." Ron felt a lump rise to his throat. He looked at George. He was clutching the core of laughter so tightly, as if he were afraid it would disappear. "He knew, George," said Ron, placing his hand on his brother's shoulder. "He knew that we would need this." "It's not about the balls," George replied, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "It's that he left us a plan. We don't just have to celebrate. We have to bring the magic of joy back into the Burrow. And we have our first task." George pointed to the scroll. On the back of the parchment, a magical map of the house appeared, on which several points were pulsing: the kitchen, the living room, and the garden near the apple trees. Secret Santa doesn't just give things, Ron realized. He gives the opportunity to heal the home. And we'll start right now. The sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, giving way to deep twilight that turned the snow-covered garden into a mysterious sea of blue shadows. Inside the Burrow, a strange metamorphosis began to take place. While Mrs. Weasley and Harry were laying out gifts under the Christmas tree, a real huge one that Arthur Weasley had dragged from the forest, and which now smelled of resin and frost, Ron and George began their secret mission. The first glass sphere, the core of laughter, they decided to release in the kitchen. George carefully placed the ball on the floor behind the large dresser with dishes. "On the count of 3, he whispered to Ron. Ron waved his wand, whispering the activation spell that was indicated in Fred's instructions. The ball cracked quietly, but instead of an explosion, a thin golden mist began to spread through the kitchen. It did not hinder breathing. On the contrary, with every breath, the people in the room felt a strange, warm tickling in the chest area. Mrs. Weasley, who had just sighed, remembering the unwashed sauceboat, suddenly stopped. A bewildered but sincere smile appeared on her face. She began to hum an old tune that Ron had not heard from her in many years. Even the plates in the sink began to wash faster, tapping out a cheerful rhythm. "Do you see this?" Ron whispered, looking at Harry and Hermione, who entered the kitchen. Harry looked as if an invisible heavy cloak had been taken off his shoulders. His eyes sparkled, and his movements became lighter. Hermione just stood there, breathing in the golden mist, and a healthy blush appeared on her cheeks. "It's so easy here," Hermione said, looking at Ron, as if all the sadness of this year just dissolved in the air. But this was only the beginning, according to Fred's plan. The next point was in the living room, where the Christmas tree stood. However, when Ron and George approached the door, they saw that Secret Santa had prepared an obstacle for them. The garlands on the tree, which until then had behaved submissively, suddenly began to weave the doorway into tight knots of magical lights. They sparkled with a cold blue light. warning that the path was closed. "They require a password," George guessed, frowning. "Or some action." Fred always loved interactive pranks. Ron looked at the map. The point on the map flickered right in the middle of the living room, but the lights became brighter and brighter, barring the way. "It's not about the password," Ron said, remembering the words from the scroll. "You are the one who holds us together. George, we don't have to break through by force. We have to share this light with others," he called out to Harry and Hermione. When all four friends gathered by the door, Ron asked them to hold hands. It was a simple, almost childish action, but as soon as the circle closed, the blue lights on the garlands instantly changed color to a warm gold. The knots untied themselves, and the path to the living room opened. In the center of the room, right under the tree, now lay a large parcel wrapped in silver paper. But there was already a name on it. "It's for Percy," Ron read in surprise. But Percy said he would be delayed at the ministry because of urgent reports on international magical law. "Then we'll have to convince him that Christmas is more important than reports," George said, and in his gaze appeared that same spark of adventurism that had always been the engine of their joke shop. "And I know how to do it." Ron felt that the second part of their adventure was coming to an end. They had not just found gifts, they began to restore the destroyed connections within the family. But he knew that the main secret of Secret Santa, the one concerning Fred himself and how his light continues to live in the Burrow, was still waiting to be revealed in the third part. Outside, the snowfall began again, but now it did not seem cold and alien, but festive and appropriate, as if every snowflake were part of that same core of laughter that spread over the world. The evening of the 24th of December descended upon the Burrow like a heavy navy blue velvet, thickly embroidered with the silver of countless stars. The snowfall, which until then had been merely light and playful, turned into a true elemental force, dense, silent, and incredibly beautiful. The Weasley house now resembled a fairy tale cake, dusted with too much powdered sugar, with warm, amber light spilling from its windows, promising everyone who found themselves inside a rescue from the frost. Ron stood in the living room, watching Harry and Hermione try to make magical candles stand straight on the branches of the Christmas tree. Each candle had its own character. One stubbornly tried to set fire to the needles, another simply went out as soon as it was looked at. It was a cozy sight, but it was hard for Ron to concentrate. In the pocket of his robes, Fred's scroll still lay, and every letter on it seemed to pulse in time with the anxious thudding of his heart. "Percy isn't coming, Mrs. Weasley said softly, entering the room. She held a tray with hot butterbeer in her hands, but her movements were somewhat mechanical. "He sent an owl. He says an urgent situation has arisen at the ministry regarding border-crossing rules for magical creatures. Something about Swedish short-snout dragons." She set the tray on the table and began to smooth out a lace doily, though it already lay perfectly. Ron saw her fingers trembling slightly. He knew that the urgent situation was only a shield Percy used to close himself off from the need to look his family in the eye. After the war, Percy still felt like a stranger, a person who had made the right choice too late, and whose presence only reminded everyone of the days of the rift. "It's not because of the dragons, Mum," Ron said, approaching her. "He's just afraid." "Afraid of what, dear?" Molly Weasley asked, lifting her tired but love-filled eyes to him. "Afraid that in the Burrow there is no longer a place for him that doesn't smell of guilt," Ron replied, surprised himself by the depth of his thought. George, who until then had sat silently by the fireplace, twirling one of the glass spheres of the core of laughter in his hands, suddenly stood up. In the light of the fire his face seemed carved from granite, but the same determined spark flashed in his eyes that always appeared before the riskiest experiments of Weasley's wizard wheezes. "Ron is right," George said, and his voice sounded unusually firm. "Percy himself will not be able to pass through his own walls. But we have Secret Santa. And we have a parcel that is intended precisely for him." He looked at Ron, and he instantly understood the plan. They couldn't just sit and wait. The magic of the house had brought them to this box, not so they could keep it a secret, but so they could use it as a key. "We're heading to the ministry," Ron announced, feeling a wave of excitement mixed with responsibility rising within him. "But how?" Hermione asked, looking away from the tree. "Flu powder only works by special permit during the holidays now, and apparating directly into the ministry in such weather. It could be dangerous." "We have something better than powder," George replied, pointing to the wooden bird that still sat on his shoulder. "This bird is not just a carving. It's a magical beacon. Fred created it for emergency deliveries to the most remote corners of Britain. It blazes a trail through any storm." Ron approached the window and opened it. The frosty air instantly burst into the warm living room, bringing the smell of pure snow and distant magic. The wooden bird quivered, its silver veins flashing with intense blue light. "You two have gone mad," Ginny exclaimed, but clear admiration could be felt in her voice. "Mom won't let you go." But Mrs. Weasley didn't say a word against it. She approached Ron and George, carefully adjusted their scarves, and only tightly squeezed the hands of both. "Bring him home," she whispered. "Please." "Home." Ron nodded. He took the parcel for Percy, wrapped in silvery paper, and put it in the inner pocket of his robes. George raised his wand, whispering the activation spell. The wooden bird flew off his shoulder and began to rapidly increase in size, until it turned into a large, semi-transparent silvery creature, similar to a Patronus, but with the clear outlines of wood. "Hold on tight, Ronnie," said George, grabbing his brother's hand. They stepped toward the silvery glow. In that same instant, the burrow disappeared. In its place came a sense of incredible speed and cold, but it was not the cold that kills, but the kind that gives clarity of thought. They flew through the night, and below them past the lights of snow-covered London, looking like embers scattered on dark velvet. The magical bird cut through the air without a single sound, leaving behind only a tail of silver stardust. Ron felt the wind hitting his face, the snowflakes melting on his cheeks, turning into tiny drops of water. He thought of Percy, of how he sat now in his cold office, surrounded by stacks of papers, trying to prove his usefulness to himself. He felt a deep sadness for his brother, who had voluntarily chosen solitude, and at the same time, the enormous power that this gift from Fred gave him. In a few minutes, the silvery glow began to slow down. Ahead, amidst the dark streets of Whitehall, appeared the entrance to the Ministry of Magic, invisible to Muggles. The bird began to descend, becoming smaller and smaller, until it once again turned into a small wooden figure that landed softly in George's palm. They stood on an empty, snow-covered street. Before them was the old telephone booth that served as the entrance. "Well," said Ron, checking his pockets and preparing for what was to come. "It's time to show our older brother what a real urgent situation from the Weasleys is." He felt the magic of Secret Santa inside him, becoming stronger and stronger. This was not just a task, it was a calling. And he was not going to back down until the last piece of Christmas pie at the Burrow was eaten by the whole family together. The telephone booth that served as the guest entrance to the Ministry of Magic looked like a forgotten monument to another era in the middle of snow-covered London. Its red paint had faded under a layer of frost, and the glass was covered with patterns of ice that resembled complex magical diagrams. Ron took a step inside, feeling the cramped space embrace him with the smell of old metal, cold rubber, and the barely perceptible aroma of Muggle tobacco preserved here from the days when the booth performed its primary function. George squeezed in after him, and they found themselves pressed against each other in the semi-darkness. Ron picked up the receiver, which was searingly cold to the touch, and began to dial the number 62442. The sound of the dial returning to its place seemed loud in the night silence, like the roar of an avalanche in the mountains. "Welcome to the Ministry of Magic. Please state your names and the purpose of your visit," came a cool, mechanical female voice that seemed to come directly from the walls of the booth. Ronald Weasley and George Weasley. "Purpose: urgent delivery of Christmas spirit," Ron replied seriously, ignoring his brother's ironic smile. Instead of the usual metal token, a tiny silvery object fell from the coin slot. It was not a token, but a paper snowflake that glowed with that same soft radiance as Fred's gift. The booth began to slowly descend underground, plunging them into darkness, pierced only by the sparks of the magical snowflake. When the doors finally opened, the atrium stood before them. During the day, this place was filled with noise, hundreds of wizards and flying notes, but at night it resembled a giant, empty cathedral of magic. The dark floor of polished wood reflected the light of their wands like the surface of a night pond, and the golden fountain of magical brethren stood as a silent group of shadows, where water gurgled quietly and melancholically, as if mourning the past. "It's so empty here," Ron whispered, and his voice flew far under the high ceiling where golden constellations slowly traveled across the blue surface. "As if the whole ministry has fallen asleep under some spell." "It's not a spell, Ronnie. It's bureaucracy. It's strongest when no one is looking," George noted, though respect for the silence of this place was felt in his tone. They headed for the lifts. Their every step echoed off the walls, creating the illusion that a whole army of invisible observers was following them. When they pressed the call button, a distant clanking of chains was heard, and a golden lift grille emerged from the darkness of the shaft. Inside it smelled of wax, ink and antiquity, scents that had accompanied Percy through all these years. Level 5. Department of International Magical Cooperation, the same dispassionate voice announced as the lift moved. Ron felt an unpleasant sinking in his stomach, a sensation that always accompanied the rapid movement of magical lifts. He watched the floors fly past them. Level 2, Level 3. Each of them was closed by dark grilles, behind which the secrets of the magical world were hidden. When the lift finally stopped, Ron took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling of his hands. The corridor of the 5th level was long and narrow, covered with a thick blue carpet that absorbed all sounds. The doors of the offices stood in tight rows, each with a heavy brass plate. An atmosphere of incredible seriousness reigned here, which felt almost physically heavy to Ron, as if he were trying to walk underwater. "There it is. The office of the assistant head of the section," George whispered, pointing to a door at the very end of the corridor. A thin strip of light shone from under the door. Percy was indeed there. But as soon as Ron reached his hand for the handle, he felt the air thicken before him. A complex protective spell in the form of intertwined golden lines flared on the door. It was the seal of absolute concentration, a spell Percy had developed himself so that no one could interrupt his work. "He's barricaded himself inside," Ron stated, feeling disappointment. We can't just go in. If we try to break the spell, an alarm will go off, and we'll be thrown out of here faster than you can say Quidditch." George frowned, analyzing the structure of the magical barrier. The lines of light pulsed with a cold, detached rhythm. "It's not about strength, Ron. Remember what was written in the scroll. Start with the heart. This seal feeds on an absence of emotion. To pass it, we don't need wands. We need memory." Ron took the memory catcher lantern from his pocket. He did not light it completely, but only allowed a tiny spark of silvery light to escape. He pressed the lantern to the cold surface of the door and closed his eyes. He began to remember how Percy, while still a Gryffindor prefect, helped him sort through difficult paragraphs in textbooks. How that same Percy was once proud of his first entry in a labor journal. And how he, despite all his dryness, always checked if Ron was warmly dressed before going out to the Quidditch pitch. The silvery light of the lantern began to absorb the golden lines of the seal. The magic of Secret Santa turned out to be softer and deeper than any official security. The golden threads on the door began to turn into soft, warm lights that resembled the light of Christmas candles in the living room of the Burrow. "It's giving in," George whispered, watching the door slowly, without any creak, open inward. Ron took a step into the office. Percy Weasley sat at the desk, head bowed over a huge scroll of parchment. He looked surprisingly lonely in the light of a single magical lamp, which picked out from the darkness only his tired face and glasses that had slipped slightly down his nose. Around him were stacks of papers, each of which seemed more important to him than life itself. "Percy," Ron said quietly, and this word sounded in the silence of the office like a promise of forgiveness. Percy flinched and raised his head. There was no anger in his eyes, only endless, deep fatigue and a shadow of that same fear Ron had spoken to Mum about. The fear of not being accepted. In that moment, Ron understood that their journey through snow-covered London was only preparation for this minute. He took the gift in silvery paper and carefully placed it on the desk, covered with reports. Percy Weasley sat motionless, like one of those stone gargoyles that guarded the entrance to the headmaster's office at Hogwarts. The light of the desk lamp picked out only the sharp angles of his face and the glasses in a thin frame, in the glass of which endless rows of reports were reflected. The office smelled of cold dust, stagnant ink, and that specific dry smell of old parchment, which seemed to have displaced all other scents from Percy's life. "Ron, George, what are you doing here?" Percy's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken for several days. "It's almost midnight. The ministry is closed to visitors. You had no right to pass through the seal." He tried to give his voice the usual official sternness, but Ron noticed how Percy's fingers convulsively gripped the quill, and in the corners of his eyes lay a deep, almost physical fatigue. "We're here on behalf of Secret Santa," George replied, taking a step forward. His voice sounded surprisingly calm, without a shadow of the usual mockery. "A new magic has appeared at the Burrow, Percy. It doesn't recognize work schedules and ministry circulars." Ron silently pointed to the parcel in silvery paper lying on top of the report on Swedish short-snout dragons. The parcel began to emit a weak, pulsing light that made the shadows in the office softer and longer. "Open it," Ron said softly. "It's not from us. It's from him." Percy hesitated. His gaze darted from Ron to George, looking for a trick or a joke he was so used to from years of living with the twins. But the brothers' faces were serious, and the air in the office suddenly filled with the smell of fresh brushwood and ginger cookies, a smell that could in no way belong to the Ministry of Magic. He carefully pulled the edge of the silvery ribbon. The paper came apart with a soft melodic rustle, similar to the sound of owl wings in a night forest. Inside lay a small, perfectly polished paperweight of transparent obsidian. Inside the stone, as if trapped in time, was a miniature copy of the Burrow. As soon as Percy's fingers touched the stone, the office around them began to dissolve. The walls, lined with folders, became transparent, and the sounds of night London outside the window were replaced by the familiar creaking of floorboards and distant laughter. Percy held his breath. Voices began to come from the paperweight, quiet but clear. "Percy, you're leaning too hard on the rules again," Fred's voice rang out, cheerful and carefree. "Remember how you tried to systematize our explosive suites by color and detonation power? We didn't have time to tell you then. You were right about the blue ones. They really exploded faster." Percy closed his eyes, and a tear slowly rolled down his cheek. This was not just a memory. It was forgiveness, wrapped in a magical artifact. Fred hadn't just left an object. He had left permission to be part of the family again, without the need to justify himself or atone for guilt with reports. "He did it on purpose," Percy whispered without opening his eyes. "He knew that I would remain here alone. He knew that you always look for structure where there should just be love," George added, approaching the desk and placing his hand on his older brother's shoulder. "But today, the structure of the Burrow requires your presence at the table. Mum won't start carving the turkey until you appear." Percy raised his head. For the first time all evening, he looked not at the parchments, but at his brothers. Something new appeared in his gaze, a spark of that same Gryffindor courage that had once allowed him to go against the whole family, and now had to help him return back. "But work," he began out of habit, but Ron with a determined gesture rolled up his report on the dragons into a narrow tube. "The dragons will wait until the 26th, said Ron, and in his voice sounded a confidence that surprised even himself. "Now is the turn for much more important magic. The magic of presence." Suddenly the paperweight in Percy's hands flared with a bright golden light. The office door dissolved on its own, and a stream of warmth and sounds of festive music burst into the ministry corridor. The magic of Secret Santa hadn't just opened the path, it had created a bridge. "Well, assistant head of the section." George winked. "Are you ready for the most important, urgent situation in your life?" Percy slowly stood up, carefully put the paperweight into the pocket of his official robes, and, for the first time in many years, sincerely, though a little awkwardly, smiled. "I think," said Percy, while making sure everything was in order, "that the Swedish short-snout dragons will manage quite well without my supervision for the next 12 hours. They left the office, and the silence of the empty ministry no longer seemed so heavy. The silvery bird that had brought Ron and George here was waiting for them near the lifts, its wings glowing with hope and a quick return home. The exit from the Ministry of Magic that night seemed to Ron like a journey from one world to another. When they found themselves again in the telephone booth that was slowly rising to snow-covered Whitehall Street, the cold London wind seeped through the cracks, bringing with it a taste of metal and urban smog. But now this cold did not seem hostile to Ron. It was only a background for that inner warmth he felt, looking at Percy. The older brother stood nearby, tightly clutching the obsidian paperweight in his pocket, and in his gaze, which slid across the frozen panes, for the first time in a long time, there was no tense expectation of another mistake. George took out the wooden bird, which in the dim light of the London lanterns again began to spread its ghostly wings. "Hold on tight," George said, and in his voice sounded the confidence of a captain who is finally returning his ship to its home harbor. The way back always seems shorter, but Fred's magic loves speed. When the bird rose into the air, London beneath them turned into a giant shimmering canvas. Ron looked down, feeling the flow of frosty air, trying to knock tears from his eyes. The dark Thames looked like a giant snake, covered with scales made of street lamp reflections, and the snow-covered roofs of the houses resembled sheets of pure parchment on which the night was writing its story. He felt Percy's hand, which held tightly to his shoulder. This touch was stronger than any words. It was the gesture of a person who had finally allowed himself to follow someone. The flight did not last long, but for Ron these minutes became a time of deep reflection. He thought about how the magic of the Burrow and the secret Santa's intent had managed to do what hundreds of conversations and official letters had failed to. He felt the memory catcher lantern in his bag vibrating quietly, reacting to the presence of all three brothers nearby. Fred's light did not just show the way. It stitched the torn fabric of their family together, stitch by stitch. When the silhouette of the Burrow appeared ahead, Ron felt his heart jump joyfully. The Weasley house looked in the middle of the white desert like a real lighthouse. Its leaning walls and numerous chimneys, from which thick, cozy smoke was pouring, radiated such a powerful sense of home that even Percy involuntarily leaned forward. The magical bird descended softly, scattering a cloud of sparkling snow around it, and in a moment they were already standing on the familiar path leading to the front door. The air here smelled different than in London. It was the smell of a clean, frosty forest, mixed with the aroma of the Christmas dinner that broke through the cracks in the windows. Ron noticed Percy hesitated at the very threshold, adjusting his official tie, which now seemed absolutely inappropriate. "Just come in, Percy," Ron said quietly, placing his hand on his back. "There are no assistants and heads here. There's only us." They opened the door, and a wave of sounds and warmth instantly hit them. Mrs. Weasley, who was just setting the last cutlery on the table, froze with a plate in her hands. Her face in one moment turned from tense to incredibly bright. She did not cry out, did not rush with reproaches. She simply put the plate on the table and took a deep, trembling breath. "You made it, Percy," she said, and in her voice was so much relief that even the plates in the sink seemed to fall silent in respect. Percy took a step toward his mother, and when she embraced him, Ron felt the last ice in this house finally melt. George stood nearby, and though he tried to look unperturbed, Ron saw that he too was smiling ever so slightly. Harry and Hermione came out of the living room. Harry only gave Percy a short nod. It was a gesture of understanding between two people who knew the price of mistakes. Hermione approached and greeted him warmly, her eyes shining with joy for Ron. She knew how much this meant to him. "The turkey just arrived," Arthur Weasley exclaimed, appearing from the garage, shaking snow off his boots. "Oh, Percy. Great, son. Just in time. I have a muggle device for slicing bread out there which I'm sure needs your analytical mind." Everyone laughed, and this laughter was completely unlike what the cause of laughter evoked. It was a real, living laughter of a family that had become whole again. Ron sat in his usual place at the table. Before him stood a large plate with his favorite sauce, but he was in no hurry to eat. He felt the magic of Secret Santa continuing to work. The parcel in his pocket no longer pulsed. It radiated an even, calm light. The third part of his mission was completed. They had returned the presents, returned the physical unity. But, somewhere deep in his heart, Ron knew that there was one more, final step. Secret Santa had not yet revealed his main secret, the one that was hidden behind the silvery tracks in the garden and the whisper in the lantern. It was a secret that was to unite not only the living, but also the memories of those who had forever remained part of these walls. Outside the window, the night became absolutely quiet, and the stars over the burrow shone so brightly as if they wanted to look inside and see this little Christmas miracle. Ron closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of home, and whispered words of thanks, to whom it was not known, but certainly from a pure heart. The night over Ottery St, Catchpole had become so deep and transparent that it seemed as if the sky were a vast dome of dark crystal, through which the light of other, distant and beautiful worlds was breaking through. The burrow stood in the midst of this boundless winter peace, releasing thin, silvery plumes of smoke from its chimneys that melted into the frosty air. Inside the house, that special silence had finally fallen, the kind that follows a great emotional storm. A silence filled not with emptiness, but with a deep, wordless understanding. Ron sat by the window in the living room, looking out at the snow-covered garden. Dinner was over. Percy had already managed to change his official tie for an old Weasley sweater, and now the whole family was gathered around the fireplace. The warm light of the fire played on the faces of Harry, Hermione, and Ginny, creating whimsical shadows on the walls hung with festive garlands. Mrs. Weasley was dozing peacefully in her chair, and her breathing was light, like the whisper of a summer wind in the reeds by the pond. Ron felt the memory-catcher lantern stir in his pocket once more. It no longer emitted a bright light, only a barely perceptible warm pulse that resembled the beating of a heart. Ron knew that his mission was not yet complete. Percy had returned. George had begun to smile, but there was one more thing. The final knot that had to be untied on this Christmas night. He looked at the chalice of sincere intentions, standing on the shelf. It was empty, but a thin aura of silvery dust still emanated from it. Ron suddenly realized Secret Santa was none of them. It was not Fred, and not even George. It was the burrow itself, the house that for decades had absorbed so much love, laughter, and even grief, that it finally found its own way to care for its inhabitants. "Are you going somewhere again?" Hermione asked quietly, approaching him. She held 2 cups of hot cocoa, and the aroma of chocolate and marshmallow instantly enveloped Ron in a cozy cloud. "I have to find the heart, Hermione," Ron replied, and a confidence sounded in his voice that surprised even himself. "The house is calling me. To where the silver tracks go deepest." Hermione looked at him with her clever eyes, and there was no skepticism in them, only silent support. She knew that in the burrow, the logic of textbooks often gave way to the logic of feelings. "Be careful," she whispered, handing him the cup. "The magic of this night is very delicate. It reacts to your every intention." Ron took a sip of the warm drink, feeling the heat spread through his body, and stood up. He did not take his cloak. He knew he would not have to go outside this time. The silvery thread in his pocket pointed not outward, but inward, down, to the very foundations of the house. He passed through the kitchen, where the remains of the Christmas pudding still smelled of cinnamon and cognac, and stopped before the small door leading to the cellar. Usually darkness reigned there, and it smelled of potatoes, but now a soft blue glow broke out from under the door. Ron opened the door, and instead of dusty stairs, he saw something entirely different. The cellar of the burrow had changed. The walls were no longer stone. They seemed woven from living roots and golden threads of light that pulsed in a single rhythm with the house. In the center of the space, where an old cauldron usually stood, there was now a small source of pure, magical energy. It looked like a small fountain of liquid silver, the water of which turned into that same mist that filled the house. This was the heart of the burrow, the place where all the magic created by the Weasley family over generations accumulated. And right here, on the shore of this silver spring, Ron saw the final obstacle. It was a wall of thick, white fog that did not let the light of his wand through. The fog was cold and damp. It smelled of forgotten promises and unspoken words. "You shall not pass just like that, Ronald," came a voice that seemed familiar to him and yet completely new. "To receive the final gift, you must give away that which you hold most tightly within yourself." Ron stopped. He realized that the fog was his own fear of being forgotten, his uncertainty, and the shadow he had always felt behind the backs of his great brothers and hero friends. The magic of the house demanded total openness from him. He took out the memory catcher lantern and placed it before him. The light of the lantern began to fight the fog, but it was too thick. Ron realized he didn't need spells, he needed sincerity. "I give away my fear," Ron said loudly, and his voice echoed off the magical walls. "I am no longer afraid to be just Ron. I know who I am. I am a part of this house, and my voice is just as important as any other." As soon as these words flew from his lips, the fog began to melt rapidly. It turned into sparkling silver that flowed into the fountain in the center of the room. The light became so bright that Ron had to cover his eyes. When he could see again, before him, on a crystal pedestal, lay the final parcel. It was quite small, wrapped in simple burlap, but a sense of incredible fullness and completion emanated from it. It was a gift that was to unite the past, present, and future of the Burrow. Ron carefully reached out to the parcel lying on the crystal pedestal in the middle of the glowing cellar. The burlap under his fingers felt not like ordinary fabric, but like something living and warm, as if he were touching the palm of an old friend. A barely perceptible aroma came from the package, a mixture of old leather, Arthur Weasley's cherry tobacco, and the fresh bread that Molly baked every morning. It was the scent of the Burrow's life itself, concentrated in a small bundle. He unwrapped the fabric, and before him appeared a wooden box made of dark, stained oak. On its lid was an engraved chessboard, but instead of the usual black and white squares, they shimmered with shades of silver and gold, as if reflecting the starlight on a night sky. "This is not just a game," Ron whispered, feeling the magical field around the artifact gently tickle his skin. He carefully lifted the lid. Inside, in indentations lined with deep red velvet, lay the figures. They were not like his old set that he had inherited. These figures were more refined, almost alive. The king had the face of Arthur Weasley with his constant curiosity about the world, and the queen, the features of Molly, full of unwavering strength and care. The bishop resembled Percy with his eternal book under his arm, and the knights were agile and daring, like the twins in their best times. As soon as Ron touched the figure of the knight, it suddenly shuddered in his fingers. A tiny wooden hoof struck the velvet, and in the silence of the cellar, a quiet, melodic sound rang out, similar to the ringing of a silver coin. "A good move, brother," came a quiet, slightly hoarse whisper coming directly from the figure. "You found the way to the very roots." Ron felt a wave of warmth pass through his body. It was Fred's voice, but it was not sad. It was part of this set, part of the great history of the Burrow that never ends. Ron realized that this chess set was the voice of the house. It was created so that in the darkest times, the family could hear each other's advice, even if one of them was far away. "Ronald, are you there?" Harry's voice came from above, from the depths of the kitchen. His friend's voice sounded muffled, but true concern was felt in it. Ron carefully closed the box, feeling its pleasant weight. He climbed the stairs, which now did not squeak, but seemed to push him upward, helping him return to the light faster. When he entered the living room, everyone fell silent. Even Mrs. Weasley woke up and was now looking at her son with unspeakable tenderness and expectation. He went to the center of the room and placed the box on the low table before the fireplace. "This is the final gift of Secret Santa," Ron said, looking at everyone present. "This is the heart of our home, and it wants to talk to us." He opened the lid again, and the golden glow from the chessboard filled the entire living room, mixing with the red reflection of the fireplace. The figures on the board began to move on their own, lining up in the starting position, but instead of starting a game, each of them turned to one of the family members. Hermione, who sat closest, leaned over the board, and the figure of the bishop, Percy, suddenly raised its wooden staff. "Knowledge without love is but dry parchment, Hermione," spoke the bishop figure in a voice that combined Percy's wisdom and a father's warmth. "Do not be afraid to close books when the heart asks for a song." Hermione pressed her hands to her lips in shock, while Percy, sitting nearby, only silently nodded, confirming these words. Ron watched as the magic of the Burrow continued its dance. He knew that now everyone would hear what they needed most. He felt like the conductor of this invisible orchestra of memories and hope. The story that began with a simple piece of paper in a silver chalice was now turning into something eternal, something that would never allow cold or loneliness to settle in this house again. Outside the window, the snow became completely quiet, as if nature too were listening to the wooden voices in the living room. Ron sat on the floor at his mother's feet, and she placed her warm, calloused hand on his shoulder. For the first time in this entire year, he felt that Christmas had finally arrived, not on the calendar, but in the very essence of their existence. The Burrows' living room at this moment resembled a magical lantern, where every shadow on the wall had its own color, and every sound was part of a great, invisible symphony. The golden glow from the chessboard on the table spilled across the room, gently enveloping those present, like a warm wool blanket smelling of a summer field and sunlight. Ron watched the faces of his relatives, and it seemed to him that he saw the wrinkles of anxiety on their foreheads smoothing out, giving way to childish wonder. The night figure, sparkling with silver veins, suddenly made a graceful leap across 2 squares and stopped right in front of Harry Potter. Harry leaned forward, and the reflection of the magical light in his glasses made his gaze incredibly deep. "Home is not the place where you were born, Harry," came the voice of the figure, combining Sirius's confidence and James's gentleness. "It is the place where you were chosen as one of their own. You are not a guest at our hearth. You are its inseparable spark. Do not be afraid to be happy, for your happiness is our common victory." Harry nodded silently, and Ron saw his friend breathe out ever so slightly, as if shedding an invisible burden he had carried for years. Then the chessboard shimmered again, and the heavy rook figure, carved from white oak, slowly crawled toward Ginny. "Your fire, Ginevra," spoke the rook in a voice in which the strength of all the women of the Weasley line was heard, "is capable of melting the thickest ice. Do not allow anyone, even your own doubts, to dim your light. You are the protection of this house, its unbreakable wall and its bravest song." Ginny straightened her back, and that same determined light flashed in her eyes that always fascinated Ron. The magic of the Burrow knew them better than they knew themselves, addressing the most secret corners of the soul. Next was Arthur Weasley's turn. The king figure, holding a tiny wooden scepter like a Muggle screwdriver, bowed before the father. "Curiosity is the highest manifestation of love for the world, Arthur," whispered the figure. "Every gear you saved and every device you studied is your way of seeing magic where others see only the mundane. Your kindness is the foundation upon which these walls stand." Arthur smiled with his soft, slightly bewildered smile, and carefully touched the figure with the tip of his finger. Then the light concentrated on Molly Weasley. The queen figure, the grandest on the entire board, raised her wooden arms as if about to embrace the whole world. "Your hands hold the sky over this house, Molly," came a voice full of endless gratitude. "Every pie, every mended sock, and every look of yours is the most powerful protective spell the wizarding world has ever known. You are the heart that beats inside each of us, even when we are far away." Mrs. Weasley covered her face with her hands, and Ron felt a silvery tear roll down his own cheek. In the living room reigned an atmosphere of such pure and clean love that it seemed as if the very walls of the burrow had begun to glow from within, radiating the warmth accumulated over the years. George, who until then had stood silently by the fireplace, suddenly took a step to the table. He pulled out the core of laughter they had found in the box and carefully placed it in the center of the chessboard. "Time for the final chord," George spoke, and his voice trembled with excitement. "Fred always said that the best joke is the one that ends in hugs." As soon as the glass sphere touched the board, magic exploded into millions of tiny, weightless snowflakes that smelled of cotton candy, pine forest, and Christmas morning. Every snowflake carried an echo of laughter. And in the middle of this golden vortex, right above the center of the chessboard, a semi-transparent figure appeared. It was Fred. He did not look like a ghost. He was woven from the very light and memories. He sat on the edge of the table, dangling his legs, and his face shone with that same mischievous smile that was once the engine of all their adventures. "Well, Weasleys?" the ghostly Fred exclaimed, and his voice filled every crack in the burrow. "It seems my Secret Santa managed even better than I planned. Ronnie, well done. You didn't just find the gifts, you found us all." He looked at George, and between them that silent dialogue took place that is understood only by twins. Fred winked at his brother and pointed to the king and queen figures now standing together in the center of the board. "Christmas is not about what's under the tree," Fred continued, becoming more and more transparent and bright. "It's about who's around it. Give Mum a hug for me. And don't forget to leave a piece of pudding for the ghoul in the attic. He did a good job today." With these words, Fred's figure crumbled into billions of golden sparks that slowly settled on the shoulders of everyone present, giving a sense of incredible peace and completion. The golden sparks that remained after Fred's ghostly appearance lingered in the air of the living room for a long time, slowly settling onto the old carpets and soft upholstery of the armchairs, like invisible magical pollen. Silence fell in the burrow, but it was a silence not of emptiness but of fullness, the kind that comes when every word is said, and every wound has finally felt the healing touch of forgiveness. Ron sat on the floor, feeling the warmth of the fireplace against his back, and at that moment, he realized that his long journey through the snow-covered garden and his own doubts had finally ended right here, in the heart of his family. "It seems this tea really does have magical properties," Harry Potter said quietly, looking at his empty cup, in which the remains of the light from the core of laughter still shimmered at the bottom. His voice sounded calm and clear, without a shadow of the fatigue that had accompanied him in recent months. Hermione Granger said nothing. She only squeezed Ron's hand tighter, and this tactile sense of warmth and support was more precious to him than any magical artifacts. She rested her head on his shoulder, and the scent of her hair, smelling of book dust and vanilla, mixed with the scent of pine needles, creating a unique aroma of peace. George Weasley slowly stood up and went to the window. He ran his finger over the frozen pane, and the frost patterns on it for a moment formed the outlines of two smiling faces. He no longer looked lonely. It seemed that the magic of this night had given him an invisible support that would be with him forever. "I think," George began, without turning back, and in his voice for the first time in a long while, that soft, confident strength appeared again. That tomorrow we should open the shop a little later. Magic has a way of tiring you out if there's too much of it for one evening. Percy Weasley, who was still clutching the obsidian gift in his hands, only silently nodded. He looked as if he had just shed the heavy armor he had worn for years. His gaze stopped on the chessboard, where the king and queen figures now stood peacefully side by side, guarding the center of the board. Mrs. Weasley rose from her chair. She walked around the room, adjusting the blankets on each of the children, and her movements were rhythmic, like an ancient dance of care. She stopped near Ron, and gently kissed him on the top of his head. "Time for bed, my darlings," Molly Weasley said, and this call to sleep sounded like the warmest spell of protection. "Christmas is already here, and it has brought us the greatest gift, the opportunity to simply be together." One by one, they began to head to their rooms. Ron climbed the stairs, listening to the house, breathing. Every creak of a floorboard now seemed to him not an irritated sound of old wood, but a friendly greeting. He went into his attic room, where Pigwidgeon only gave a quiet hoot in his sleep, not opening his eyes. Ron went to the window. The snow-covered Burrow garden now looked completely peaceful under the shine of the stars. The ice sculptures of the gnomes began to slowly melt, turning into the pure silver of memories that would nourish this land until spring itself. He lay in bed, feeling the pleasant coolness of the sheets and the weight of the blanket that Mum had hand-woven for him. In his head, Fred's words still echoed about how he, Ron, was the one who held them all together. He no longer felt like the shadow of his brothers. He was the light that had helped the others find their way. The magic of Secret Santa had fulfilled its purpose. It had not just given things, it had healed the heart of the home. Gradually, the light in the Burrow's windows began to fade. The last to go out was the candle on the chessboard in the living room, leaving behind a thin trail of smoke that smelled of honey. The house plunged into a deep, restorative sleep. The ghoul in the attic stopped rattling the pipes and curled up in a ball under an old pipe. The gnomes hid deep under the roots of the apple trees, and the magical garlands on the tree only occasionally flared with soft gold in the semi-darkness. Ron closed his eyes. His breathing became even and calm. Before his inner eye, the silver thread appeared again, but now it did not lead somewhere into the distance. It was woven into every corner of this room, into every smile of Mum's and every joke of George's. Magic was everywhere. Magic was in love, which is stronger than death, and brighter than any sun. "Merry Christmas," Ron whispered into the darkness itself, and it seemed to him that the whole house answered him with a quiet, cozy echo. Night fell, long, quiet, and full of magical peace. And in this night, every inhabitant of the Burrow knew that they would never be alone again, as long as the fire of this special Christmas light burned in their hearts.